Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of all of living nature, I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. The theme that we want to explore today is the inside story of war, because there's an outside and an inside. And we wanted to take up this theme, given what's happening in the Ukraine. We're being deluged 24/7 with information about what the government wants us to know about the invasion of Ukraine. And probably most of it is untrue. But we're being shaped in our perceptions about what's happening in order to garner support for a remilitarization of Europe. And we've spoken about this matter a couple times on Humanity Rising. We've had several people from the intelligence community that have spoken to us about alternative viewpoints of what we're being officially told. And today we want to hold up a distant mirror, going back to the Vietnam War. Those of you who remember the Vietnam War, I was coming of age. I turned 18 during the Vietnam War, so it was acutely important for me. I refused to draft because I didn't buy into the prevailing narrative that the communists had invaded South Vietnam and they were the aggressors, and they had engaged in unprovoked attacks against the South Vietnamese, and the United States had to go in and help this ally. It's the same storyline that we're being told about Ukraine today. And it's worth thinking about because we're being whipped up today in the same kind of frenzy that they tried to do in Vietnam. And then, kind of out of nowhere, an analyst named Daniel Ellsberg released through the New York Times and Washington Post and so forth, what became famously known as the Pentagon Papers. And that showed incontrovertibly the machinations of the US government and certain allies around the foment that led to the carnage of Vietnam that killed over 2 million Vietnamese and nearly 60,000 US soldiers before the US left in defeat, with a lesson that was unlearned because we did it again in Iraq and we did it again in Afghanistan and other places around the world. And it looks like we're doing it again in Ukraine. I know to speak like this, as we've done before, alerts people because most people have bought into the prevailing narrative. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be bringing on other people like Daniel Ellsberg, actually, during Vietnam, that are challenging the prevailing narrative. And today we're going to bring Danny Sheehan back to Humanity Rising. He's been on a number of times before. I'll introduce him more fully in a moment. But before we dive into this very rich history and distant mirror, let's just pause, as we always do as we begin Humanity Rising, and just take a moment and center ourselves in our bodies. And close your eyes if you can. And center your attention on your heart. And for just a minute, attune yourself with your heart and feel the suffering in Ukraine, and the suffering of war, and feel compassion. Thank you, everyone. And now I'd like to invite Daniel Sheehan, who's one of the great constitutional litigators of our time, actually, who over the last 40, 50 years has been involved in some of the major cases in the United States having to do with civil liberties, human rights. We had him on last month to talk about the Iran-Contra case in which he was involved. And today we want him to tell the story of the Pentagon Papers, because he was the young attorney in the law firm Cahill Gordon that received the call from the New York Times as that great case unfolded that went all the way to the Supreme Court. So Danny, I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising, as we are once again in a highly militarized war situation, just to tell us the story of the Pentagon Papers as you viewed them as a young attorney. And Danny will take 40, 50 minutes just to tell the narrative, and then I'll circle back and we'll have a dialogue for the balance of the time. So welcome, Danny, to Humanity Rising, and just tell us the story of the Pentagon Papers.
Terrific. Thanks, Jim. Well, first, I'll apologize to everybody that I had dental surgery all day yesterday, so I may be a little bit slushy here, but it'll go away in another month or so. But the bottom line is that that I was 26 years old when the Pentagon Papers started. So I was a little bit older than Jim. So I had been right at the flush of the Vietnam War and had been drafted twice, actually, to try to get me to go there. So I had developed a very strong aversion to the Vietnam War because I had been I studied it in my junior tutorial at Harvard College, the same place where Daniel Ellsberg had gone to school, and I had I won't go into great detail about it, but I had started college at Northeastern University before I went over to Harvard College, and there at that time all American men, young men, when you turn 18 years old, you were required, mandated under the law, criminal law, to go and register with your local selective service agency and let them know that you were available to be drafted if, in fact, the United States national security state decided that they wanted to deploy U.S. military forces somewhere in the world. So I had gone in when I was 18 and registered, but I was going to be going to the United States Air Force Academy in any event. That's where I was planning on going to school to become an astronaut. But that had not worked out. The United States Senator Jacob Javits had given the appointment to the son of one of his major financier people for his campaign. So I ended up not having applied to other schools. So my aunt got me registered at Northeastern University, where I could work for 10 weeks and then go to school for 10 weeks. So there at Northeastern University, they had the largest United States Army ROTC program. So I was in that and was studying in training to be a Green Beret. And I've been confronted by the reality of Vietnam by being instructed at Fort Devens by a young Spec 4 Specialist Fourth Class U.S. Army Ranger when we were doing halo diving, the high altitude and low opening chutes for diving in behind enemy lines. And he told us that, when we parachuted into Vietnam or North Vietnam, that if anyone saw us, we had to kill them immediately and bury them with your chute. They explained that. And I realized that, here we are being trained to parachute into somebody's hometown, 8,000 miles away, and kill them, even if they're children or a woman or an old person, kill them and bury them with your chute. And I just said, look, this is ridiculous, and walked out. And they drafted me because I had left the program only partway through the 2 years of training. And so I'd had this confrontation with them. I was fortunate enough to transfer to Harvard College and studied there about the Vietnam War. And so I was doing a great deal of reading and analysis of the Vietnam War, and came to realize that the United States government in 1954, after the signing of a peace agreement between France and Vietnam, it resolved the fact that France had actually had sent a gunboat into Vietnam back in 1848 or something, and had ended up just their sailors had gotten into a fist fight with some of the people in the town. And so the French sailors retreated to their ship and then fired on the town of Saigon and took it, and then didn't know what to do with it. And so they kept it because they wanted France to have some colonies like other countries were doing at that time. And so they were ultimately driven out of Vietnam by the Vietnamese people. And in 1954, the troops of Vietnam had surrounded the French forces at Dien Bien Phu and had bombarded them and caused them to surrender. And the Vietnamese gave them a certain number of weeks to withdraw all of their troops, and signed an agreement that they would be allowed to withdraw their troops beneath a certain parallel of latitude, but under no circumstances was that ever to be considered a boundary separating Vietnam into two parts. And that was perfectly understood. And when the French withdrew, Richard Nixon, who was the vice president at that time with Eisenhower in 1954, they decided that what they were going to do is they were going to go in and replace the French as a colonial power in that area. And so what they did is they recruited a young man by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem, who was actually a graduate student at Columbia University at that time in New York, and brought him in. Flew him in and set up a totally artificial government in the southern area of Vietnam, and then declared the line of latitude south of which the Vietnamese had allowed the French to withdraw their troops, and then declared this to be a separate country. And that Ngo Dinh Diem was this popular person, they said, that was going to be supporting Western values, going to allow American corporations to have access to the resources of South Vietnam, and it was going to give the United States government a foothold in Southeast Asia, military foothold. Now that's what was really going on there in Vietnam. And when I graduated from high school in June of 1963, you remember President Kennedy was still alive at that time. And President Kennedy had resolved that he was going to be withdrawing a contingent of U.S. military forces that had, over the period of the Eisenhower-Nixon administration from 1954 to 1960, had built up in Vietnam. And Kennedy had determined that this was an unjust and unrealistic military venture. And he was getting set to withdraw them just before he was assassinated. And when Lyndon Johnson came into office, Lyndon Johnson turned and decided he was going to crank up the Vietnam War, that he wanted to be viewed by the China lobby, the major business people in the United States who wanted to develop the economic resources of Southeast Asia, that he was going to be their champion and was going to win the Vietnam War. And so it was in that context, starting in November of 1963, that Lyndon Johnson began to set upon, now that he was the new president, upon the assassination of President Kennedy, that he was going to figure out a way to justify, in the eyes of the citizens of the United States, launching a full-scale military invasion into Southeast Asia. And what happened is suddenly there was this announcement that our American warships that just happened to be in the vicinity of Vietnam on a peaceful patrol, U.S. gunboats had been fired upon, been attacked by North Vietnamese sailors, their navy, which they don't have, had attacked them. Some gunboats had allegedly come out from the shoreline and attacked our U.S. military ships out there. And so all of a sudden, he announced that he was going to be sending what eventually became 500,000 U.S. military into Vietnam. And they began drafting all kinds of young men at that time. As I say, I transferred over to Harvard College in 1965, and I had gotten drafted in 1965 when I left Northeastern University and withdrew from the Special Forces training program in the Reserve Officer Training Corps, and they drafted me the minute I left the Northeastern University, and I refused to go, and went over to Harvard College and undertook my junior and senior year at Harvard College. And so for my junior tutorial, I was working on the study of the war in Vietnam. And so I became quite familiar with the detailed history, at least the public history, of Vietnam, and the whole history of how France had come to assert its colonial authority in that whole region, and how the Vietnamese people had organized and mobilized and driven them out, and how the United States had moved in complete defiance of the Treaty of 1954 between the French and the Vietnamese, and had just asserted itself and taken over as a colonial power. So I knew all about that, so I spent the 2 years, my junior and senior year at Harvard College. I was the nominee for the Rhodes Scholarship from Harvard College in 1967 when I graduated, and I got drafted again. And my draft board told me that I couldn't leave the country to go take the Rhodes at Oxford. And I was a little peeved at that thing, but I made it clear to them that I wasn't going to do this. I wasn't going to go there, that I thought this was an unjust war. I wrote them a major memo on the illegality of the war. And I went up to Harvard Law School. And at Harvard Law School, I became the the research assistant for Professor Jerome Cohen, who was the head of the International Law Department at Harvard Law School. And so I worked with him on his book about the illegality of the war in Vietnam. And what I did is I just started sending chapters of the book as we finally edited it. Each one of these chapters, I was sending it to my draft board in New York and making it clear that not only was I not going to go, but if they tried to force me to go, I would fight them in court, and I would produce witnesses that made it clear that this was illegal, and I would present witnesses that from my time at Northeastern, where we were being instructed by U.S. military personnel to kill civilians in Vietnam. And so I just kept pouring this on to them. And so, but the bottom line is that by the time I got scheduled to graduate in 1970, I had become the co-founder of the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review at Harvard Law School. And I ended up initiating the case that was ultimately to establish the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources. That went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. We had initiated that case at the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review on behalf of an NBC television journalist by the name of Pappas. And it went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And the long and short of it is that the NBC television news guy, Pappas, refused to allow NBC legal counsel to represent him because they didn't believe in the existence of a First Amendment right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources. They had refused to protect him when he was subpoenaed to turn over some of his outtakes of his interviews in the case. And so we had taken it up at the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review on his behalf and had gone all the way to the United States Supreme Court. So I got recruited by the Cahill Gordon law firm down on Wall Street, which was the major corporate law firm for NBC News. And in that context, I had been asked to help write not only the briefs in chief for NBC in front of the United States Supreme Court on that case, but I was also helping to draft the amicus briefs, which are friend of the court briefs that are submitted at the United States Supreme Court by other parties that have an interest in the issue that's before the court. So I ended up, in addition to drafting working on with others, the draft of the primary briefs for NBC, I did the briefs for ABC and CBS, and also for the New York Times and the Washington Post. So because I was the one that had kind of conceived of this fundamental right of journalists, I was sort of central to helping to draft the briefs for the various parties about how that right would affect their particular publication. So in that context, I got to meet James Goodale, who was the general counsel and executive vice president for the New York Times. Now, all of that followed from my getting recruited in 1970, in June of 1970, to go down to the Cahill firm down in New York on Wall Street from Boston. And so I was there working on the briefs for the United States Supreme Court on the Pappas case and Earl Caldwell in Brandsburg, that were co-cases that came up with it. When in April, April 2nd or so I remember it was the Tuesday after Easter. So we're right now coming on to Easter Sunday this weekend here in April of 2022. And so this is 51 years ago on a Tuesday morning on the 2nd of April, following Easter Sunday, that I was in the office. I was at the Cahill firm of the 176 trial lawyers. I was the only bachelor there. They viewed it as a sign of instability, that I wasn't married and had a house with a mortgage and 2.3 kids and had to do whatever it is they told you to do. But anyway, I was there early in the morning. I was there at like 6 o'clock in the morning, working on some of the briefs, and I got a call from Jim Goodale, the general counsel for the New York Times, and he said something important has happened here, and he wanted to come over and see us. And I said, great. I said, should I call Floyd Abrams, who's our partner in our First Amendment section? He said, yes, get a hold of Floyd. And I also got a hold of Gene Shyman, who was my contemporary. He was the editor-in-chief of the Brooklyn Law Review. And I'd come off the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review, and we were teamed up working with Floyd Abrams on all these briefs on the First Amendment. And so I got a hold of Gene, and Gene called Floyd, and Floyd came over. He got there about 7:30 or so in the morning, and Jim Goodale shows up. So we're sitting in the office, Floyd and Gene and I, and Floyd is saying, "What is this? What is this about?" And I said, "I'm not sure." I said, "It's something important because Jim called us directly and wanted to meet with us right away. So we've come in here early, and so we get told that Mr. Goodale has arrived. So in he comes into the office. We're in Floyd Abrams' office, and Jim comes in, big 6'3" guy, like 240-pound, great big guy, big booming voice, and real smart, intelligent guy, and he comes in and sits down in front of the desk of Floyd. Floyd's behind his desk, and Gene Shyman and I are sort of on the sidelines there. And so Floyd and Jim are having this conversation about, oh, how's the family? How's everybody? How's Sabra? Floyd's wife, and and they're going along like just, like, my, aren't the walls straight up and down now? And so I'm sitting there going, wait a second. I said, excuse me. I said, Jim, I've just gotten Floyd in here early, and Gene, you've obviously asked us here to tell us something. Can you tell us what it is? And so he gets up and goes over and closes the door to the office. And he says, well, as it turns out, one of our reporters, Neil Sheehan, no relation, has just obtained gotten a hold of 47 volumes of top secret U.S. Pentagon documents that are a Rand Corporation study that was commissioned by Robert McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense, earlier under President Kennedy and then President Lyndon Johnson. And he wanted to have an analysis of how in the world we got into this. Now, this is 1971. This is June of 1970 or April of 1971. So by this time, Richard Nixon had become president. So even though the Nixon administration was in power, there had been a report that had been prepared by the previous Kennedy and Johnson administration doing an evaluation of how we had actually gotten into the war and how the decisions were made, what was going on, how decisions were made to escalate this, and what the purposes of the war were, and were they being met by the present operations, et cetera. A very thoroughgoing 47-page top secret Rand Corporation study. And Neil Sheehan had secured a copy of it from one of the people that was involved at the Rand Institute. Floyd, of course, was going, whoa, wait a second here. You're in possession of a top secret set of documents now. Yes, he said, and Jim Goodale said, in our law firm, Lord, Day and Lord, they told us that if we didn't give them back immediately, they were going to turn us into the FBI. So, because as it turned out, much to their surprise, two of the major partners at Lord, Day and Lord had been involved with drafting the national security rules and regulations about top secret government documents. And so they had taken a special umbrage at the idea that the New York Times would maintain possession of these top secret documents, sort of in defiance of all of their work personal work in that area. And so Lord Day and Lord had refused to protect them in their right to have these documents. And so Jim Goodale had called over to me. He knew that I had been the originator of this idea of journalists and news media like New York Times having a constitutional privilege to protect their confidential news sources and to be able to get access to information like this. And so he had called me. He said, I've come over here to talk with you here at the Cahill Gordon Law Firm about what you think we ought to do. So I said, this first year associate at the Cahill firm, I said, well, you should print them. Obviously, I said, the only question you really should have is what the size of the font would be on the front page of the New York Times announcing the securing of these documents. And Floyd Abrams jumped up and said, wait a second. He said, that's not the opinion of the firm. It's not the official opinion of the firm. And so Floyd was trying to restrain us from rendering any kind of final opinion on this. But Jim Goodale was very happy that I was saying this. And so he kind of shimmied his chair over toward where I was sitting and said, really? He said, so what do you think will happen? What do you think will happen if we decide to start publishing these? And I said, well, given the fact that John Mitchell is the Attorney General under Nixon, who is a bond lawyer who thinks the Constitution is a ship that sits in the harbor in Boston, I said he'll probably threaten you. He'll threaten you and Punch Sulzberger and Neil Sheehan and everybody else he can think of with some sort of criminal charge if you don't give them back. And he said, really? He said, what kind of charge do you think they might have in mind? And I said, well, if we're lucky, espionage. And he said, espionage, lucky. And I said, yeah. I said, U.S. v. Gorin. U.S. v. Gorin. U.S. v. Gorin is a major United States Supreme Court case that said that if you charge someone with espionage, the violation of securing or revealing national security information is inherently so vague and overbroad that in order to prosecute someone, you have to be able to prove beyond any reasonable doubt scienter or an actual evil intent on the part of the person who has secured the information or revealed the information, that they're intending specifically to damage the national security interests of the United States government and to foster and promote the interests of some foreign power. And I said, they're never going to be able to prove that. And Mitchell is such a jerk there in the Attorney General's office that he won't even know that. And so they think that's the worst charge they could make. And so that's probably what they will say. And so he goes, espionage, and he moves his chair all the way back over in front of Floyd. And so we have this conversation. And so I tell him, look, I think what you ought to do is we ought to secure these papers. And what we ought to do is get a team together of people to start going through the 47 volumes and start figuring out what your lead story is going to be. And you're going to have to get these things together fairly quickly here because it's possible that the people at Lord Day and Lord, Brownell primarily, are going to call somebody. They're going to call somebody. What, love? No, I don't, Sarah. I'm in live Zoom. Okay, sorry about that, gang. There's another meeting that they want me to go to, but so the bottom line is that we said that it's likely that Brownell over at Lord Day and Lord is going to call the FBI and tell them that you've got these documents. So you better hurry up because you don't want them to get out ahead of us on this thing. We want to take the initiative on this thing. And so Floyd is having a hemorrhage here behind his desk because here's the first year associate, telling the New York Times, here's what they ought to do and get started on this. And I said, get the documents somewhere where we can see them go through these things and then try to figure out what the most important stories are that are contained in these documents. And then what we'll do is figure out what the different legal arguments are as to why the revelation of that information does not, in fact, violate the national security interests of the United States, or more importantly, does not generate irreparable damage to the United States national security. And so they began that process. They actually got Neil Sheehan. They actually rented a set of suites in the Plaza Hotel there in New York City, and brought the 47 volumes in. They copied. We at the firm made them copy a whole additional set, so that we had one. So we had one at the law firm, so we could see what the documents were. We had access to the content, and they had the originals over at the Plaza Hotel. And Neil Sheehan and the other people were there going through the documents to figure out what particular stories they ought to lead with. And one of the and so that we went through this entire process between April 2nd all the way to June. And on the morning of June 13th of 1971, the New York Times came out with its first edition, front page story with major font of the top secret documents that we had. And the first story was they were revealing the fact that that Lyndon Johnson had lied flat out all about this alleged Bay of Tonkin event that he asserted had happened, that these gunships somehow from the North Vietnamese Navy had attacked the USS Henry Knox, an innocent warship that just happened to be coasting along off the coast of Vietnam, when it turns out that that ship had been shelling the entire coastline. The USS Henry Knox had been firing major cannons onto the shoreline all along the coast of North Vietnam, trying to instigate some kind of reaction on the part of them. But the Vietnamese basically didn't have any navy. They may have had some boats with an outboard motor or something on them, but so that what they had done is they had completely fabricated this event with this attempting to instigate some sort of response from the Vietnamese people by shelling their shorelines, and some boat had come out toward where they were. This is an outboard motor boat, and so that they made up the fact that they had fired some sort of a torpedo at the USS Henry Knox, which was totally false. And so that they sent a communication from the USS Henry Knox back to the Pentagon saying, we've been fired upon. But within a minute, they reversed it and said, no, we don't have it yet. They really haven't fired anything at us. And so that within a minute, they knew perfectly well that it was a false notice. But Johnson and the other people inside the administration who'd been wanting to figure out some rationale for sending U.S. military forces in, seized upon the first communication, ignored the second communication, said, we've been fired upon. We were just engaged in just innocent cruising somehow in international waters. We weren't in international waters. We were right up next to their shoreline. And so that story broke in the New York Times, and that this was revealed in detail with the internal cable traffic that was in the documents. And so we published from June 13th, 14th, and 15th. We were in our third day of publishing, filling up not only the front page, but pages inside the New York Times with the content of these documents. The discernment of which was all being done by Neil Sheehan and the other staff at the Times. And on about the third day, I get a call at the office. I get a call from Whitney North Seymour, who was the chief legal counsel for the United States Attorney's Office. He was the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York in Manhattan. And he called me on the phone and said, Mr. Sheehan, this is Whitney North Seymour. And I said, Whitney North Seymour. Am I supposed to know who you are? And he said, I'm the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. And oh, right. That Whitney nurse, Seymour. And he was pissed off right from the very beginning in this telephone conversation. And he said, look, I'm calling to let you know that we know that you've got these papers. I said, that was a great insight since they're on the front page of the New York Times. He said, but anyway, I'm calling to demand that you have your client cease and desist from continuing to publish these papers. And I am insisting that you communicate that demand to them. And I said, no way. I said, I'm not even going to convey that to them. I said, because I would advise them not to obey it. So I'm not even going to bother communicating it to them. He said, you have to communicate it to them. He said, this is a demand from the United States government to the New York Times. And you're, as their legal counsel, obliged to communicate that to them. I said, no, I'm not. I said, not only that, but I'm not going to do it. So, just understand that. And he said, well, in that case, we're going to be bringing an action tomorrow in front of Judge Murray Gerfine over at the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, like at 1:00 in the afternoon. And I'm calling to give you the courtesy of your firm of letting you know we're going to be there. And I said, well, we're awful busy over here, as you might imagine, with all these papers. And I'm not sure whether we're going to have time on our schedule to do that. But I appreciate the courtesy. And I said, so, but you're telling me what, you're going to be asking for a prior restraint against the New York Times? He said, well, prior restraint. He said, I don't want to get into arguing semantics with you. And I said, well, what's the semantics? You're asking for a prior restraint to be imposed on the New York Times by the United States government. And he said, well, again, I'm not going to argue with you about the terminology here, but we'll be there and we're going to be asking for this. And I said, well, okay, I appreciate the courtesy. And then he slams the phone down. So I go in and tell Floyd that, that Whitney Norris Seymour and his crowd from the Southern District of New York are going to be going over to Murray Gerfine tomorrow at 1:00. And so we need to decide whether we're going to go over there to oppose this. And so he had at our office at Cahill at that time, his Floyd Abrams, constitutional law professor from Yale Law School, and Alex Bickel, his name was Professor Alex Bickel. And Bickel was in the office working with us on the briefs on the First Amendment case in front of the Supreme Court on the right of journalists to protect their confidential news privileges. And we'd had a number of rows over this because I was taking the position that, that a journalist had an absolute right not to reveal the confidential sources that they had or the content of what the information was. And when it was published, they would reveal the content of the information, but they didn't have to reveal the source because that would shut off the access to the information and it would chill other people. And so, Alex Bickel was always taking the position, no, you can't do that. You can't insist upon an absolute right like that. There has to be some balancing tests. You have to balance the interests of the government and the grand jury against the interests of the journalist. And I was saying, is it Bickel? I said, you're known throughout the entire legal community for being able to balance away any right that anybody else can assert. So I used to have this kind of intense discussions going on with Bickel, but because he was Floyd Abrams' constitutional law professor at Yale Law School, he was there in the office and working on this. So Floyd decided that he was going to bring Bickel with us the next day. And he was going to bring the senior partner, Larry McKay, from the Cahill firm. So the next day at 1:00, myself, Floyd Abrams, Gene Scheinman, Larry McKay, our senior partner, and Professor Alex Bickel go over to the court, and we go upstairs. And they decided not to have it in the courtroom. They didn't want to have an open discussion in the courtroom. They were going to have it in chambers, in Judge Murray Gerfine's chambers. Now, Judge Murray Gerfine had only been on the bench for like about 3 months. He'd been appointed by Richard Nixon to the federal district court. And just as a sidebar, I think they were quite confident he was going to agree to do whatever they asked, because Murray Gerfine had been an assistant district attorney in New York City under Tom Dewey. When Tom Dewey was the district attorney in New York, before Tom Dewey had become the governor of New York. And Murray Gurfein was a very trusted guy in the Republican Party. And Murray Gurfein had actually been the guy sent by Tom Dewey, after Dewey had become governor of New York, up to meet with Lucky Luciano of the mob, of the mafia, up in Comstock Prison, up in Great Meadows, New York, to negotiate to get the mafia to agree to serve as scouts for our troops invading Italy, going in at Salerno and Anzio. And that was that whole deal that got cut between the United States government and the mafia back in 1944, pursuant to which Governor Tom Dewey agreed to grant a suspension of his sentence and allow him to be released from prison, because Tom Dewey had been the district attorney that had prosecuted him on white slavery for handling prostitution and stuff. And so Tom Dewey released him from prison, and it was Murray Gurfein that had been the one who conducted that kind of secret negotiation back in 1944. So everybody figured, and clearly Whitney R. Seymour and the Nixon administration assumed that Murray Gurfein was going to do whatever it is they wanted. So we go into the chambers, and we're all in there, and so Judge Gurfein is behind sitting in his bench, or in his desk. So we're all arrayed in the office there, and there's Whitney R. Seymour over on the right to where we were, and Judge Gurfein says, "Okay, how should we proceed, gentlemen?" And I said, "Well, it's their motion. I mean, they're obviously here seeking a prior restraint on the New York Times, and so ask him what his support for that is." And so Whitney R. Seymour gets up and says, "Your Honor, there's information in these papers that, if revealed to the public, would irrevocably damage the national security of the United States." And so I said, "Like what?" And Floyd Abrams thought that was kind of rude, that I wasn't being very polite to Whitney R. Seymour, and I ought to be conducting myself in a more judicious manner in front of Judge Gurfein. But I said, "Like what?" And he said, "Well," Whitney R. Seymour said, "Well, I'm not at liberty to disclose that right now because you don't have the adequate security clearances." And I said, "So you're not going to reveal it to us?" So I said, "Good. Are we done here? You aren't even going to be willing to proffer any evidence to support this kind of bald accusation you're making?" And he said, "No," he said, "you don't have the clearances, and I'm not going to reveal that." And so Judge Gurfein was kind of taken aback, and Judge Gurfein said, "Well, Mr. Seymour, how about you reveal it to the court? You just give us the information about this." And Whitney Seymour said, "No, Your Honor, I'm sorry. It turns out that you don't have the security clearances either, so I can't give the information to you either. And you're just going to have to take the word of the government that there's information in here that, if revealed, would irrevocably damage the national security of the United States." And I said, "Absolutely not." I said, "That's ridiculous." I said, "You've got the burden of proof on trying to get a prior restraint against the New York Times, the first prior restraint in history, and you're not even going to proffer any evidence at all." And Judge Gurfein was saying, "Mr. Seymour, I'm a little shocked about your position here, but you expect me to be able to rule on this without you giving me any information at all about what you say is going to do that, going to irrevocably damage the national security of the United States?" And Whitney R. Seymour said, "Well, that's my position." And I said again, I said, "Good. Are we done here? Aren't we done? Can't we leave?" And Judge Gurfein says to Floyd Abrams, says, "Mr. Abrams, I'm assuming that your firm has a copy of these documents." And I said, "Excuse me, Your Honor." I said, "You can assume whatever you want." I said, "But we're not admitting that we have a copy of these, and we aren't required to admit it." And Judge Gurfein says, I'm talking to Mr. Abrams. Mr. Abrams, what I'm asking is a courtesy to the court. Would you provide a copy of these documents to me so that, untutored by Mr. Seymour here, that I and my clerks can go through these as fast as possible, and unless I'm able to see something that I'm convinced irrevocably damages the national security of the United States, then I'll deny their motion." And so Floyd says, "Okay, we'll do that. We'll give you a copy." And I went, "What? I can't believe you're doing that." But he said, "Yes, we'll give it to you." And so So Murray Gerfine says, okay, good, let's do that. You get a copy of that over to me right away today, and we'll start this process right away. We'll finish this as soon as possible. So I'd like to ask Mr. Abrams, I'd like to ask another favor for the court. Could you get your client to agree to stop publishing these papers voluntarily until I get a chance to go through these with my law clerks and make some decision about this? And I said, absolutely not. No, absolutely not. We're not going to voluntarily agree to stop publishing these. That's what Mr. Seymour asked us to do to begin with. We already refused to do that. And the judge said, well, in that case, I'm going to enter a restraining order against the New York Times if you're not going to agree to do it voluntarily. And I said, well, we're not going to do it voluntarily. And he said, well, I'm going to enter a restraining order then against the publication, any further publication of these papers until I and my law clerks have a chance to go through these. I said, but I want to make it clear, I will do this as fast as possible, as fast as humanly possible without any kind of guidance from the government here, and to see, we don't have any special training, so we aren't necessarily going to recognize these things, but we're going to do it starting right today. And so I went, shit. I said, that's a really bad idea. What's going on here? But Floyd ended up, having a copy of these all printed up for us, for him, and brought them over to him, had him brought over to him. I wouldn't bring them over to him, but he did. And they start going through them, without any assistance from the government. And like 3 days later, he contacts us and asks us to come over to the court. We go back over to the court, same personnel, go back over there, and the judge says, well, I've gone through this, and in light of the fact that Whitney North Seymour has not agreed to give me any guidance on this, or my law clerks, we have been unable to determine anything that we think is inevitably going to destroy the national security of the United States. And so I'm lifting the restraining order, and the New York Times is free to publish these. And so Whitney North Seymour is shocked by this, and he says, whoa, wait a second, Your Honor. He said, can you keep the restraining order on in time for me to go up to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals and appeal your order and try to get a stay on this? And Judge Gerfine said, no. He said, I'm not going to leave this restraint on the New York Times for 1 minute more than was absolutely necessary. You can do whatever you want. So Whitney North Seymour says, oh, I'm going upstairs right now. I wish Mr. Abrams and the people from Kale will come with me. I'm going to go upstairs to the motion judge in the Second Circuit and demand that a stay be put on your order. And so we all traipse up. We go upstairs we're in the United States District Court house in Manhattan, over by Wall Street there. And we go upstairs. Then he goes into the chambers of Irving Kaufman. Judge Kaufman was a member of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and he was the emergency motion judge. And so he goes in, Whitney North Seymour goes in, so we follow him into the office, and he makes his pitch. Same thing to Irving Kaufman, wants to have an emergency stay put on the order of Judge Gerfine, and wants to restrain the New York Times from being able to publish. And we opposed it. And then Irving Kaufman, this is an extraordinary story. Irving Kaufman says, well, gentlemen, he said, 25 years ago to the day, 25 years ago to the day, I was asked to enter a restraining order in a case, and I didn't do it. And I've often reflected upon that as whether I made a mistake in that case. And so in this case, I'm not going to make that mistake. I'm going to enter this restraining order. And we're going to stay the publication until the Second Circuit can meet. And I'm going to skip a 3-judge panel. We're going to go right straight to the full 12-judge bench of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals on this. And so we'll do this with dispatch right away. And he was he was talking about the Rosenberg case. L. Rosenberg. It was 25 years ago to the day, Irving Kaufman had been the one who refused to stay the execution of the Rosenbergs for allegedly turning over nuclear bomb secrets to Russia. And so in both cases, he had ruled the way the government wanted him to rule. And he was coming off as this sanctimonious guy that was kind of regretful for the fact that he'd not stayed the execution to give them a time to continue their appeal. So the bottom line is that we end up going in front of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. We didn't get any sleep. We go back to the office, working like mad. We're going to be in front of the full 12-judge Second Circuit Court of Appeals. So in a matter of a couple of days, we're there in front of them. And we come in, and it's Floyd Abrams, myself, Gene Scheinman, and Alex Bickle. And we're in front of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and they set up a special rule. The only people that were going to be in the courthouse, in the chambers of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, their full ceremonial courtroom, were other federal judges from around the country and their law clerks. And because this was an absolutely historic case, first time in history that a prior restraint had been entered against a news media, and it was the New York Times, after all. And so we had the number one litigation law firm in the country, Cahill, representing the New York Times. We had the Justice Department there. I mean, here we were arrayed. Here are these judges all throughout the courtroom. There must have been 50 of judges, federal judges from around the country, had flown into New York to be here for this argument with their law clerks. It looked like a reunion of our Harvard Law School. That's what it looked like. I recognized like half of all the guys that were there, who were law clerks. And so we proceed to have this argument, and the Second Circuit Court of Appeals rules in our favor, and agrees that it was error to issue the original restraining order, and that there was no grounds for continuing the restraining order, but they would, as a matter of procedure, they would hold the restraining order in place until the United States Supreme Court could rule on this. And they would demand that an immediate convening of the Supreme Court be held. And so that all the clerks of the United States Supreme Court went looking for the judges, because by this time, this was like from June 13th, this must have been around June 21st, 22nd, all the judges were gone. They were all out on vacation, right? And so they had to, I know they had to go get Justice Douglas, who was halfway up Mount Rainier out in Washington State. He was mountain climbing. And so they had to go get all the judges and bring them all in. So we ended up going in front of the Supreme Court 13 days after the original restraining order was put on the New York Times. You can imagine 13 straight days of constant 24-hour research, the movement stuff that we were doing. Bottom line is that we ended up making the argument. Look, the United States Congress has never passed a secrecy act like they have in England and other places. Congress has been asked to do this any number of times. When the Congress of the United States has been confronted with an issue and they refuse to do something, the executive branch does not have the authority to take the position to just say, well, we'll do it if Congress won't do it. The federal executive branch possesses no inherent authority to do something like that. And Congress, we argued, didn't have the authority either, because the First Amendment says Congress shall pass no law restricting the freedom of press. So we took that flat out position. We had 4 of the judges that were on our side. But of course, we had Hugo Black, and we had Justice Douglas and Brennan and some of the others. These were the major people at the time. But on the other side, they had Chief Justice Warren and Harlan, and I guess it was Whizzer White. Whizzer White was on their side. So we knew what the issues were. So we argued the case. And so we were down in Washington, D.C. We flew down from New York, and we were at the hotel that night. And Floyd Abrams came to me and said, look, I need to have you go meet with Professor Bickle. And you're going to have to insist that Bickle, if he's going to come with us to the argument tomorrow morning in front of the Supreme Court, that he does not take a position that there is some inherent authority that resides in the government of the United States to restrain the publication of information by the New York Times. Because he's constantly worried about this troop ship analogy they keep talking about. Is that what if, in fact, someone comes into possession of the sailing schedule of our warships in time of war, and wants to publish it on the front page of the New York Times, and so the enemy will know? Isn't it clear that there has to be some inherent authority on the part of the government to stop that? And I said, at least one of the questions is that the executive branch can't do it, even if the Congress conceivably could do it, but the Congress can't do it either because of the First Amendment. So I'm saying, no, there is no such inherent authority. And so he said, but you got to talk to Bickle. He said, because if Bickle won't agree to not grant the troopship analogy, granting inherent authority in the government to do this, we're going to have to tell him he can't come with us. And so he said, I can't go tell him that. He's my professor from law school, but you go tell him. So I went and met with Bickle and had this major set to with him, which I'd had a number of in the past, and said, look, here's the story, that if you try to insist upon the fact that there's some inherent authority that resides in the government to stop the presses, just because there's something in it that allegedly might damage the national security of the United States, you aren't going to get to come to the argument. So let's work out some kind of a compromise. So what he did is he ended up agreeing that the executive branch had no such authority, which is what the case was here, and that the executive branch joined together with the judicial branch had no such authority. That if any such authority existed, it would have to exist in Congress. As the governor of the United States, citing the old case of Sawyer, Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer, which is an old case where Truman sent in the United States military during the Korean War to take over the steel mills in Pittsburgh because the Union struck there. And the United States Supreme Court ruled that the executive branch had no such authority to do that. And Justice Jackson in that case went through this long explication of what the limited powers were of the executive branch in the event that Congress had been confronted with a question and had refused to do anything about it. So we ended up winning the case, and we won the case. And it's the only case in the entire history of the United States Supreme Court with 9 judges on the Supreme Court that has 10 opinions. And so there was this little per curiam opinion that said whether or not there exists some inherent authority on the part of the government to stop the publication of information that might irreparably damage the national security of the United States. They haven't shown it in this case. And so therefore, we're going to reserve that question as to whether or not there exists such authority, but it doesn't exist in this case. And so that we're ordering the lifting of the stay on the New York Times. And so we went back to publication the next day and continued publishing these. And what it revealed, very importantly, is the fact that the United States government, executive branch, and military industrial complex has been engaged in, since the end of World War II, in mounting a national security state. And with the passage of the National Security Act of 1947, they created the Central Intelligence Agency. They later created the National Security Agency. They have there's a whole series of CIA and all these different organizations that are engaged openly, well, actually covertly, in attempting to promote and foster the interests of major corporations. And that what they want to do is open markets in different parts of the world for access by our American corporations. And that they basically believe that what's good for General Motors is good for the country. And if they can get access, privileged access to the resources of the world on behalf of our corporations, that somehow the money that's being made by the millionaires that own the stock in these corporations, there's somehow trickle down to the rest of us in the country, even though history has shown that it doesn't. And so the revelation of the Pentagon Papers, it played a major role, not the most major role. The most major role was the fact that the Vietnamese drove the United States military out of Vietnam, hanging on the bottom of helicopters. But from a legal point of view and from a political point of view, the position that's taken now by most of the legal world is that the victory in the Pentagon Papers case was the fatal blow to the Vietnam War. The revelation of all those details. That the fact of the matter is, not 1/100th of 1% of the people in the country ever read all the stuff in the New York Times and have not read the details that were in the 47 volumes, which the New York Times later published, the full 47 volumes, except for the portions that acknowledged that the United States Central Intelligence Agency was smuggling heroin out of Southeast Asia, and they were using a portion of the profits from the sale of the heroin to secretly finance a massive political assassination program called the Phoenix Program. It took us many more years to get that information revealed by the Church Committee, Senator Frank Church from Idaho, and they staffed a major set of investigations on the Senate side under Frank Church, and on the House side by Otis Pike. So they had revelations of further things the United States Central Intelligence Agency was doing, fostering and promoting war, political assassinations, et cetera. But this was this extraordinary period of time that went on between 1970 and basically 1980, that whole period of time where there was this huge upheaval to bring to an end the Vietnam War, to bring Richard Nixon to the bar of justice, to get him impeached, to get him to resign from office, to get the Church Committee hearings going on, to have a review of the assassination of President Kennedy, and also Reverend King, to look in to see what role the Central Intelligence Agency and the covert national security state played in potentially assassinating these major opponents of war. So this was an extraordinary period of time. I was fortunate enough to be at the right place at the right time, and I guess taking the right position on these issues. And so I ended up not only being able to be one of the principal attorneys for the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers case, but I was later at the office of F. Lee Bailey, and we got to represent James McCord, the CIA wiretapping specialist, who was arrested in the Watergate Hotel, and got him to blow the whistle on Richard Nixon, and writing a letter to Judge Sirica revealing the fact that that they were working to. Anyway, it was a long story, but I've been at this now for 50 years. And have been fortunate enough to be involved in some of the major cases of that period and of later periods. And so that's why Jim, who's a dear friend of mine, and we were together at Harvard Divinity School doing our master's work there together, has asked me to come and share this with you, because the machinations of the national security state people in the United States is just as bad. And the kind of things that they've done are just as bad as those things that we see going on in Ukraine right now on the part of Russia. This insane dialectic of the good guys versus the bad guys, the capitalists versus the socialists, and the nation state of Russia versus the US. I mean, this kind of dialectic is a fundamental danger, not only to our human species, but to all life on our planet and to the climate system of our planet as a whole. This putting at the disposal of the interests of private corporations, business corporations, privately owned, all of the instrumentalities of the American government, including our military and our covert operations, the CIA, is a disaster. And we've got to undo this. And our generation, the baby boomer generation, has to ally with the millennial generation and with the Generation Z. We've got to organize and mobilize and get people to have a more critical view of what's being told to them. And this propaganda that's going on. I mean, it's absolutely true that the Russian government is propagandizing their people. The people inside Russia believe that this is some sort of limited military excursion into the Ukraine to protect the Ukrainian people against Nazis, because that's what they're being told. We're being told every single night. You turn on CNN or MSNBC or any of those, you turn it on, and all you get is this barrage of, oh, look at these bodies lying in the streets. Look at the buildings that have all been blown up. I mean, that's what happens in war. And that they're just whipping everybody up to support a more massive military confrontation with Russia, and it's insane. It's a function of some sort of a brain disorder that some people have in our human family. And the sad fact is that we vest these people with authority through electing them. We've got to unelect them. We've got to have a whole new generation of leadership in our country that is infused with spiritual insight in the sensitivity for life in general. And that's why, you should look to Pope Francis's encyclical called Laudato Si. It's his encyclical on global climate change, to figure out how we can mobilize spiritually and from a spiritual perspective to try to raise the consciousness of our people to disassemble the sinful structures of the national security state, not only here in Western civilization, but also in Eastern civilization with both Russia and China. We've got to do this, and the time is now, because if we have to do this, or else they're going to destroy the entire climate system of our planet on behalf of the oil corporations. Okay, so this is the story of the Vietnam War, which is one chapter in an ongoing saga of attempting to disassemble the national security state here in the United States and in Western civilization, so that we can survive as a species. So I've probably gone over my time, but I wanted to get to tell you the story.
Danny, thank you. That was a tour de force with details that I'm sure most people have never even heard about how you took it all the way to the Supreme Court and won the case on behalf of democracy and the freedom of speech. Why don't just take a minute? Where was Daniel Ellsberg in all this?
Well, it was funny. Dan is the one that delivered the papers to
Right.
Neil Sheehan, and during the fight, people can confuse the two cases. This is the case for the New York Times and the right to publish the papers. After we won the case in the Supreme Court, we discovered that our office was being wiretapped by the FBI. That wiretapped our law office, trying to find out whether we were talking to the source of the papers. But Scotty Reston called Floyd Abrams and told him that he'd found out that we were being wiretapped. So Floyd called Whitney North Seymour and got him to take the wiretaps off our office. But then Ellsberg ended up getting revealed of being the person who had provided the papers. And I thought that we were going to end up representing Dan Ellsberg, because I had been asked, among other things, to prepare a criminal defense for Punch Sulzberger, Neil Sheehan, Jim Goodale, and also whoever the source was of the documents. I had prepared a whole set of defenses, constitutional defenses for all of these people. So when it got publicly revealed after we'd won the case in the Supreme Court, it got revealed that Dan Ellsberg was the source of the papers, and he got indicted. And so I thought we were going to represent him. So I got called by Larry McKay, the senior partner, who at the firm, and I went up to see him. And I said, "I assume we're going to be representing Ellsberg." And he said, "No, we're not going to represent Ellsberg. It's one thing to represent the New York Times, which is a multi-million-dollar client. It's a lot different than representing a traitor." He said. I went, "What?" And so what I did, I found out that Leonard Bodine and Charlie Nesson were going to be representing Dan over at the Rabinowitz Bodine and Standard law firm. And so what I did is I Xeroxed all of the legal analysis that I had done and all the defenses for all these guys. And I Xeroxed them and brought them over to Leonard Bodine and gave them to Leonard. So it's one of the things I think that the firm got upset about when he asked me to leave. But anyway, I brought all the documents over to them, and Leonard Bodine used those as the basis for the defense against the charges against Dan. But as you know, the charges were ultimately dismissed against Dan. He was not acquitted. What happened is they dismissed all the charges against him on the grounds of prosecutorial misconduct, because they discovered through the revelations of, as it turns out, of James McCord, who I later represented after I got asked to leave the Cahill firm. I went to F. Lee Bailey's office. I mentioned that we got to represent James McCord in the Watergate burglary case, and he revealed to Judge Murray to Judge I'm trying to remember it now. But anyway, he revealed in the letter that he wrote to the judge in that case that they were burglarizing all kinds of places, including Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist. They broke into the plumber's unit, in addition to breaking into the Watergate Hotel to spy on the Democratic National Committee. They had broken into the psychiatrist's office of Dan Ellsberg, trying to get at the kind of the most sensitive data that he might have revealed to his own psychiatrist. And so the judge in that case dismissed the charges against him on the grounds of prosecutorial misconduct. So it turns out I happen to be involved in both of those cases. So a lot of people think that I was involved in Dan Ellsberg's defense, but I wasn't. At least I was only indirectly by providing the legal arguments in support of it, and also helping to get the revelation that his psychiatrist's office had been burglarized by the Justice Department people.
Yeah, and just one note, and I know this is a vast subject, and we don't have a whole lot of time, but you mentioned Kennedy's withdrawal from Vietnam and that decision. As you understand the history of that time, was there any connection between his decision not to pursue Vietnam and his assassination?
Well, there were a number of factors that were involved in the assassination. I mean, first of all, you have to try to determine who it is that did it, and then to figure out why they did it. It's clear that Allen Dulles is the one who sort of helped choreograph that assassination. The former head of the Central Intelligence Agency, who'd been fired by Kennedy in 1962 after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. But the bottom line is that Allen Dulles helped coordinate that operation using the forces that had been coordinated by the Central Intelligence Agency to try to assassinate Fidel Castro. So we know a lot of the details of all that. We can have a whole session on that someday. But the bottom line is that the primary reason why President Kennedy was assassinated by the S-Force, the group of 15 anti-Castro, rabidly anti-communist Cuban refugees in Miami, was that was an assassination team that was put together by Richard Nixon, basically back in 1960, to assassinate Fidel Castro. That team was turned against the president to assassinate him primarily, and this is another whole subject, because he, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, was engaged in secret communications with Nikita Khrushchev to physically disassemble all of the nuclear warheads of the United States military in exchange for the Russians disassembling theirs. And Pope John the 23rd was going to be the one to broker that deal. and when it got this, they were exchanging these secret letters back and forth that Cousins, Norman Cousins, is the guy that was actually delivering the letters back and forth. And they were getting ready to exercise their respective executive authority to disassemble the military warheads of the United States and Russia. And the people said that that's not going to happen, and ordered his killing. And that's what happened. So it wasn't, but his withdrawing from South Vietnam was also part of it, because he had struck this after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, when we'd come within minutes of launching a complete thermonuclear exchange between Russia and the United States that would have destroyed all of civilization, if not our whole species. That Kennedy and Khrushchev both were so struck by how awful that situation was that they felt compelled to move to try to disassemble the nuclear warheads. And the powers that be, that were represented by Allen Dulles, who was the legal counsel for Brown Brothers Harriman, which is a major private investment firm of some 24 of the most powerful men in the world financially, are the ones. He was legal counsel for Brown Brothers Harriman. That's why he was made the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And it was these guys who basically decided that this guy had to go. And so that's why he was killed.
Boy.
We should have a whole session on that. So
yeah, we will
give you the details of that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Danny. And just so everybody knows, about once a month, every 4 to 6 weeks or so, we're going to have Danny back, because I don't know of anybody personally that has such an encyclopedic knowledge of recent American history from the point of view of the Constitution and the point of view of the democratic rights, which generation by generation we have to fight to secure. So when we hear these stories, they are illuminating not only for the history that they reveal, but also they hold up, as I said at the beginning, a distant mirror, so that when we look at the assault on democracy today, when we look at the propaganda machine on all sides around the revitalization of war, we're better informed and we're better able to make reasoned judgments about what's true and what isn't true in our world today. So I'm very glad to say that Danny will be back in a month or so. We'll announce that. And I suggest, Danny, the next time, let's do Watergate.
Okay.
Just sort of keep the sequence.
Okay, well, Watergate's a good one. Good one. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Danny.
Terrific.
Thank you, everyone. You're welcome to the After Chat group, those of you who can make it. And we'll see you all here again tomorrow, same time, same station, for Humanity Rising. Bye for now.
Guys. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.